You're listening to the Scaling Culture podcast, where we sit down with thought leaders who share their experiences building incredible workplace cultures. Our guest today is Bob McDonald, former United States Secretary of Veterans Affairs and former CEO of Procter & Gamble. Bob brings a wealth of experience and wisdom in leadership, having guided both military and corporate teams through complex challenges. His focus on values-based leadership and attention to detail has set a high standard in organizational culture. In this episode of Scaling Culture, Ron and Bob discuss the importance of aligning personal values with organizational goals, strategies for building a culture of trust and accountability, insights on leading through crises and driving organizational change, and the role of empathy in leadership and how it can impact team performance.
Welcome to another episode of the Scaling Culture Podcast. I'm your host, Ron Lovett, and today I'm very, very excited to have the Honorable Bob McDonald with us. Bob, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Ron. It's great to be here. I'm a great admirer of your work and particularly your focus on culture, since I think that's so rare.
Well, thanks. And just for context, so Jesse, our Chief Operating Officer, and Hugh Goodday, Chief Legal Counsel and Head of Growth, went to West Point and met Bob and was able not just to meet Bob, but really bring back some key nuggets from West Point, which I've just been all over. And so I had the opportunity to meet Bob and of course, ask him to join us on this podcast. So Jesse and Hugh both say hello, and they're huge fans too, Bob, and very grateful for your teachings down there.
Well, I'm fans of theirs. It's my belief that leadership is the most important element of any organization or any family for that matter, and that we don't spend enough time being deliberate and intentional about leadership. So it was a thrill to meet people from your organization who already get it, already understand the importance of leadership, and were insatiable learners.
Yeah, great. And so I'll kick us off with this, Bob. So coming from the 82nd Airborne, what's something that you learned from jumping out of planes that you still have brought to your life today? As what's a lesson? What's something you're like, wow, I'm never going to forget this thing. I go back to that. It's stamped me in a good way.
I'd like to say two things if I can, Ron. They're related. Number one, attention to detail. When you're jumping out of an airplane with a parachute on your back, when you're the jump master, which I was, which meant I was responsible for getting soldiers out of the airplane. I was responsible for their safety and also their equipment. You have a lot of attention to detail. You don't let a detail go by. And I think attention to detail is an important lesson of leadership. Secondly, and this is related, is when your life's in danger, you tend to perform at a different level. And Tom Kolditz, who was the head of the Department of Behavioral Sciences and Leadership at West Point, wrote a book called In Extremis Leadership. And the idea was that in extreme circumstances, people perform leadership functions at a different level. And one of the things I struggled with in business throughout my career was, how do I create that same culture, to use your word, culture, in an organization where people's lives aren't in immediate danger, but they're in danger over a long term, if I can say that, in terms of survival of the business. And that's the challenge.
And so let's go to that for a sec. So what are some of the attributes? Because, in a high stakes situation, where have you seen leaders get it right and weather the storm? And where have you seen leaders get it wrong when the stakes are high? Because I assume you've been in lots of these situations in business and in your formal life.
Well, I'm going to talk about a business situation, actually, where the stakes were high, but not immediately high. Nobody's life was in danger. But I remember being in a meeting in Toronto, Canada with Procter & Gamble, and my boss, who was our division manager, was reviewing our profit forecast. And he thought that the total delivered cost, the cost of goods sold was way too high that was being forecasted by our product supply organization. He walked into the room and basically threw down the deck and said, "This is unacceptable." And he walked out. And I thought, oh my gosh, what a terrible leadership trait or action to do that and then simply walk out. We've never seen a group of people work so hard and come back with an outstanding result a couple of days later. So I learned that, not necessarily sitting down and being the coach is always the best technique. And I thought a lot about Blanchard's situational leadership model, where the more urgent the situation, the more critical situation, the more task oriented you become. You might not have time to explain your decision to everybody in your organization uh, when you're in that kind of an urgent situation.
That's really interesting. I go back to my days in the security industry, and what you're saying makes me think a lot about. I think, Bob, in my past, I've caused confusion on decision making, and I think I've confused people around me. What I mean by that is, if I was doing security for a Rolling Stones concert, and the fence were to fall down during the concert, I'm not asking any questions. It's move, Bob, grab the corner. Here we go, go, go.
Yeah.
In other times, when we're in a collaborative environment, I'm asking lots of questions, and we're really having this collaborative decision-making process to solve a problem that is the risk is, or sorry, the pressure's not on. We've got time. It's not for 2 weeks or 2 months or whatever it is. And I think I confuse people because I think that caused some confusion. I'm like, whoa, 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 whoa. Today you're kind of giving us direction, but yesterday we were involved in this process. So what I've been trying to do, and I'm curious your thoughts on this, I've been trying to open up discussions with today. This is how the decision is going to be made to try to clarify that. Does that hit home for you? Am I doing it right, wrong? What are your
Yeah,
thoughts?
I think you put money in the bank on the days where things aren't urgent. You explain things, you explain how things are. Importantly, you demonstrate your values and your purpose. And then when the days where things become urgent, you may not have time to do that until later, but people know where you're coming from. I'm a huge believer, and I think I shared this during my time at West Point when I spoke. I'm a huge believer in writing up your individual leadership philosophy. What I suggest is going back through your career, identifying the leadership experiences you had that you found cathartic, helicoptering up from those into what the belief it shows, and then sharing those beliefs with the people you work with. I first did that in the 1980s, and I've been doing it ever since, keeping this list of 10 alive. And every time I go to a new organization, I share that and we discuss it so people know that in an urgent situation where I may be more task oriented, where my instruction may be coming from. It also is a vehicle for dialogue. And as I said, dialogue about leadership is always a positive thing.
And I know, Bob, you really believe in values-based leadership, right? I think you talk a
Right.
lot about that. I was at a conference in Asheville, North Carolina last year, and one of the speakers got up and I had this kind of aha moment. Of course, I was curious at first when they mentioned this thing, and when people make me curious or uncomfortable, you've got my attention. And so he said he was talking about leadership. I can't remember the gentleman's name. Great talk. And he said that there's this huge opportunity, missed opportunity for people that have families to test leadership in the home because the stakes are low. You're not going to get fired. Your children aren't going to fire you. And I thought, wow, what a great way to hack the system. I could learn how to have a tough conversation with my son, my two daughters. And so I don't know. Have you heard of that? What are your thoughts on this? And maybe you're naturally doing.
I'm actually a huge believer in that, Ron. Whenever I give a talk on leadership, I always remind people not to forget what they're doing at home. Now, I tend to articulate it differently than the individual you heard, although I'm not sure I disagree with him, which is what's more valuable than your family? What's more valuable than your children? What's more valuable than your grandchildren? So whatever you learn in leadership, please pass it along. I mean, we've all heard the statement of I think it goes something like the cobbler's children have no shoes. We as leaders worry about our businesses and the people who work for us, but we sometimes forget about our families and children. And arguably, they're even more important, at least more important in carrying on the legacy of you and your family.
Yeah, so what I'm hearing you say is don't insulate your family from the learnings in business. Make sure you instill those values and lessons in the home.
Yeah, there's a statement in the West Point Cadet Prayer that I often use called "Help me to choose the harder right rather than the easier wrong." And people that I've spoken to during my career have found that to be very powerful. I use it a lot, and it's gotten to the point now where my children and grandchildren say, "Oh, Dad, I've heard that before." That's a good sign.
Right. Right. Absolutely. And so go back to values-based leadership. Some probably haven't heard of that or have their own version of what that means. What does that mean to you, Bob?
Well, when I think of an iceberg, right? And think of an iceberg, and of course you see the tip of the iceberg above the water. That's the behaviors that we perform as leaders. And I would say that I can teach leadership to anyone. Leadership is a learned process, and it's a series of behaviors. And when you see that collective set of behaviors, you then identify that, you label that as leadership. Well, there's stuff below the water that leads to those behaviors. What are those? Well, they're life experiences, as we talked. My first day at West Point, when I first approached the first upperclassman I saw, and he said, new cadet, step up to my line, and I stepped on the line. He said, I said, step up to my line. I stepped back. He said, step up to my line. And I got it. Attention to detail was an important part of that training. Whereas in high school, if I stepped up to somebody's line, it didn't matter where I was. So that's a life experience, and that affects the behaviors. And then underneath those life experiences are your values. Some of us have faith in a certain religion. Some of us have values about West Point. We say we don't lie, cheat, steal, nor do we tolerate people who do. Those are all values, and values get built up over time. They become habits. Those habits become experiences. Those experiences become behaviors.
Right. No, yeah. And so we're going through this process right now, and you touched on this, where we as an organization are defining what leadership means here. And I have some questions around that because, I don't know if you read this book, Nine Lies About Work, Marcus Buckingham, Ashley Goodall. Have you heard of this book?
I've heard of it, but I've not had a chance to read it yet.
Okay, there's some interesting stuff there. One of the things that they challenge, and this is interesting, was that leadership's not a thing. And it's not a thing. It's leadership is the someone being followed by it's spikiness. You could be a great soccer player and people follow you. And so you're a leader in soccer and you might not even be able to speak. And then, of course I didn't agree with that. Then I got to thinking and I thought, well, that's interesting because yeah, it is spiky. People follow Barack Obama and Donald Trump. That's very different leaders. And so I guess my question is, one, what are your thoughts on that first? And then I'll get to kind of scaling leadership in organizations. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Well, I understand what they're saying. To me, leadership is not a position, right? As I said earlier, leadership is a collective set of behaviors. And in any given situation, someone can be the leader even without a title making them the leader. We used to call the Procter and Gamble company, and I would say this at the VA as well, that we're a democracy of ideas. Whoever's got the best idea, I want them leading, even
Love
though I
that.
may have a larger title. And what you've got to do is create a culture that is intimate enough and egalitarian enough that people feel comfortable stepping forward and taking the initiative to lead, even though they may not be the ranking person. You and I talked about my time at the VA, and you may recall that I followed a secretary who was forced to resign because some veterans were having difficulty getting care in Phoenix, Arizona. And one of the things I recognized was that the culture of the organization was much too hierarchical, that people valued themselves based on whether they attended meetings with the secretary. People always stood up when the secretary walked in the room. We had flags, we had tent cards on the table, very, very formal culture. Well, it's hard for bad news to travel in a formal culture. So what I did was I tried to make the culture more informal, more like a business, frankly, more like Procter and Gamble, where I showed up from the Army calling everybody sir and ma'am, and I was told to call everybody by their first name. So intimacy leads to trust. Trust leads to information flowing more easily. And that allows people to take initiative with their ideas. And that allows you to have an innovative culture. Sometimes what you have to do is you have to reward people for coming forward with a bad idea, because you don't want to punish people with bad ideas, because then they'll never come forward again. So I see leadership more as behaviors, and
Right.
I categorize those behaviors in 5 categories. I call it the 5E model. It's a model we helped develop at Procter and Gamble. Envision, creating a vision for the organization. Engaging the employees in that vision. Energize, motivating people and providing the right systemic motivation to get that vision accomplished. Enable means building the organization capability to achieve that vision. And then last but not least is execute. Execute meaning, if you can have a great strategy, but if you don't actually execute it, you're not going to achieve it. So if I see any of behaviors that fit into those 5 categories, those are behaviors that I would say is a part of leadership.
I love that because to me it sounds like, and sorry, was that Procter Gamble or is this a program you guys built at West Point? Where did that come from?
No, it's Procter and Gamble.
Okay.
The 5 E's were from Procter and Gamble.
So to me, when I was writing these down, you could hold someone accountable. You could check and balance those things. There might
absolutely.
be, right?
In fact, what we did was we created a computer-based model that you, Ron, for example, could go out and say, okay, I want to get feedback on my leadership. So I want to send this questionnaire to superiors, subordinates, peers. You get back the feedback. It's all sorted, sliced, and diced for you. You get the verbatims, and then you've got scores on each one of those E's. And maybe not surprisingly, through my experience in doing this over a good number of years, the E that most people fall down on is building organization capability, enable.
So enabling people to do things, essentially, that's
Yes.
part of enabling,
Well,
right?
and building the leadership teams, the strategies, the systems, and the culture to do it.
I love this. Envision, engage, energize, enable, and execute. And I love that it's just rounded out with execute because, as we know, the difference between a really good idea and a bad idea is can you execute? And so,
yeah. And it's, of course, the focus on behavior.
And so when at Procter Gamble, if someone was to move into a leadership, did you have a process to say, okay, Ron, we're looking at you, you've done some low risk leadership. You ran a picnic or I don't know, whatever you did, but now we're looking at you leading some folks. Would you figure out where I was today? Could you do that? Or would you have to put me in the ring and then see how that went?
We would train those 5 E's from the day we recruited you. Not the day we hired you, the day we recruited you. And we would get a sense for how you stacked up versus those 5 E's. And then that became part of your evaluation and development process once you joined the company. The challenge was, and this is always a challenge, and this gets back to trust, is using it as an evaluative tool or using it as a development tool. Because sometimes if you use things as an evaluative tool, it turns people off from using it as a development tool. I don't know if I'm being clear, but once you realize that your annual performance review is going to affect your ability to get promoted, you behave differently for that review than if it's there to help you build a capability you may not have. And that's all about trust, right? You have to trust the organization. You have to trust your boss to be looking out for you, that the evaluation is fair and that they're helping you.
Well, when you said that, is there a tipping point? Does it go from developed to now you're a senior leader? We're evaluating you because we're going to ask people, how is Bob doing or how's Ron doing these categories? You're going to move eventually to get evaluated, correct? Once you've.
Yes, absolutely. In fact, at each point of the spectrum, and I think this is true of any organization, the process becomes more and more deliberate and more complicated to evaluate someone. For example, before I became CEO of Procter and Gamble company, I'd been with the company for 28 years, and but I had to sit through a psychological battery of testing. So yes, it becomes much more deliberate, much more intentional, and much more complex as the higher you go.
And so, was there the spirit at Procter Gamble of absolutely stubborn on vision, those 5 E's, but flexible on execution? And what was the balance?
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, we often talk at P&G about hard points and soft points. In other words, what are the hard points of the strategy and what are the soft points? The soft points meaning you then have the ability to execute. In the military, we talk about this as well. In the military, it's talked about as commander's intent. So, for example, I ask you to go into a village in Afghanistan. I tell you, my commander's intent is to clear the village of the enemy and provide for the population so that they will help us fight counterinsurgency, let's say. That's my commander's intent. And I'm not more specific than that because you may go in the third house on the right and open the door and somebody shoots at you. So you have to have the flexibility to respond in the right way. So I would be hurting you if I gave you an order, an operation order that was more detailed. Well, the same is true in business. You have to give people the flexibility to execute within the guidelines, within the hard points. We used a technology called OGSM, or Hoshinkanri. It was a total quality technology that came from Japan. Edward Deming, the famous statistician, taught total quality to the Japanese car companies, and that's what made them so successful in the 80s. And from this came this process, OGSM. O is objective, G is goal, S is strategy, M is measure. Objective is words, like vision. Goal is measures. How do you measure whether you achieve that objective? S is strategies. That's words again. M is measures. And then what OGSM run companies do is the goal, for the next organization down, the goal becomes the objective. The measure becomes a strategy. In other words, it cascades throughout the organization. When I needed to change the VA dramatically because we were unsuccessful in 2013, I used a process called leaders developing leaders, and it's the same idea where I would have the leadership team train its next level. We would then provide workbooks and DVDs of that training so that they could go back to their organization and train the next level. They would then train the next level and so forth until you got down to the bottom of the organization. Because the acid test of a high performance organization is, does the lowest ranking employee, let's say the custodian who cleans the hospital room, have line of sight from their behavior every single day back to the vision of the organization. So through that process, everybody has to develop a personal project that ties back to the superior organization. And that's one way to get people rowing in the right direction. The famous instance of that is when I think it was President Kennedy going through Cape Canaveral, and a guy is pushing a broom on the floor. He says, what are you doing? He says, I'm putting a man on the moon. To have that line of sight in an organization is incredibly powerful. Most organizations don't have it.
His involvement with the bigger picture. And so being and actually this came back from Hugh and Jesse through West Point, which I love, and I posted online about it. But this goal of not communicating to be understood, but communicating to be 100% not misunderstood. And I love that upgrade of, which must be kind of military based. That feels very military.
Actually, that
strategy.
It's a great line. The way I first heard it was when I took 7 Habits of Highly Effective People from Stephen Covey back in about 1983. it was seek first, understand, but basically the
Yeah.
same idea. Yeah, very, very powerful.
Well, when I heard that, Bob, because I really love to look in the mirror and say, what's the next level for me? What's the next level? I love leadership, love leading, love culture. And I thought, oh, that's interesting. So I feel like I do a decent job with, okay, Bob, I don't know if I completely understood. We said, let me play that back to you to ensure that I'm not misunderstood. What I don't do a good job of is, Bob, can you play that back to me? I've
Yeah,
given you
right.
some instructions. Can you play it back to me? Which I was like, oh, that's what they're talking about here. I thought it was fantastic. I mean, there was another line. I don't have it in front of me, but it's like, someone hasn't, you haven't communicated properly until someone's played back what they've heard. There was a line like
Yes.
that came from West Point.
Yeah. Well, it reminds me of an instance I had when I was leading Procter and Gamble in Japan and Northeast Asia, where we were trying a new product called Febreze. I don't know if you've heard of that product. It's a great product. College students love it. Rather than washing their clothes, they Febreze them. But anyway, I had a couple of young people working on this, and we couldn't figure it out. But we knew that it was a very important product for Japanese, because the average Japanese apartment is about 70 square meters, 700 square feet or so. It's not very big. They aren't really rooms. They move furniture in and out as they need it. So when you cook something, which they do a lot, the odors permeate the house and they get captured in the fabrics and so forth. And so
In the hallway, they're going right to the hall.
exactly. So we're talking about this, and this team of people came up with this idea of cycle of odors and how they would demonstrate that the product didn't just cover up the odor; it actually engulfed the malodor molecule and dissipated it as the alcohol evaporated. Anyway, I didn't understand it, and so I said, can you explain it to me again? They explained it to me again. They were speaking English, and I said, okay, explain it to me in Japanese, because I think I'm missing it in the local language. They explained it in Japanese, and I said, I still don't get it. So let's take some money. Let's go up to Hokkaido Island, which is roughly 10% of Japan. Let's try it. And they tried it, and it built the business 35%. We expanded throughout Japan. It built the business 35%. We did it globally. When I was in charge of that business globally, it built the business 35%. So sometimes you have to remember that as a leader, you have the ability to allow others to lead when it's more appropriate for them to lead. And you just have to try to understand what they're trying to tell you. And if you don't understand it, maybe give them a chance.
I think of two things. One, so I'm dyslexic and have ADHD. And so I have a very hard time understanding some complex stuff. Like when you were talking about that, I'm like, there's no way I would understand that. You know what I do today to hack the system? This is my utilization of AI. So if it was an article or someone was to say that to me, I would record it in AI or cut and paste the article and say, can you please explain this to me like I'm a 5-year-old child?
Interesting.
And it works very well for my brain. I hack the system.
That's a great idea.
I'm curious, Bob. I had Jeff Immelt. I'm sure you know of or know Jeff.
Yeah.
He's
Yeah.
with
Jeff and I
GE.
know each other. We were both
Right.
CEOs about the same time.
So he was on the show not too long ago, and I asked him, "What was the first thing that you do when a leader comes into a significant leadership role, a regional leadership role?" And this kind of smacked me in the face too. I'm curious your thoughts. So he said the first thing I do when I sit them down is I tell them, you have way too much influence now. You cannot talk out loud anymore. And I was like, what? And because in my brain, I mean, I just talk out loud all the time. And I'm like, whoa, that's like counter to what I do. And he said, yeah, because when you talk out loud, people are writing it down. They don't know if it's like to action. In most cases, it's not. You're just talking out loud. And I that made me very uncomfortable actually at first, which was he caught my attention. And so I've started to say to folks, I'm just talking out loud right now. Like, get ready. Don't write any of
Yeah.
this down.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts on that? Makes sense?
I think it's very important for leaders to be self-aware. We talked a few minutes ago about the importance of deliberateness in leadership or intentionality. And when you're leading a small organization in high school, it's okay to allow your leadership to occur serendipitously. When you're Jeff Immelt running GE and you land in, make it up, Turkey, and you get off the plane and you're going to be there for a half hour to an hour or two day or two, those people, that may be the only time they see the CEO of the General Electric company. Well, now you'll never see the CEO of the General Electric company, but that may be. So you have to be conscious of that. You have to be self-aware, and you have to be prepared and intentional about what you're going to communicate. So I do think self-awareness is very important, and you've got to be aware. Similarly, people are very sensitive to leaders who are hypocrites.
Right.
And the worst thing you can do is commit a behavior that is a violation of the company values. I had a general manager working for me in Japan who was married, went to Korea, and was seen by our Korean employees horsing around, doing the wrong thing. And that word got back to me, believe it or not, over the weekend while they were there. And the question was, what are you going to do about it? Well, in some cultures, you would say, well, that's the person's personal time. They can do whatever they want. But in a culture like the Procter and Gamble company, where trust is one of the bedrock values, if employees in Korea see this individual violating the trust of their family, how do they then project that behavior on trust of the organization? So obviously we had to have that discussion. And these are the things. You've got to be self-aware. You've got to be self-aware. Everyone's watching you. Are you going to be the kind of leader with character which is homogeneous? I can cut Ron any way I want, and he is homogeneous. Or are you going to be a leader that lacks character, that mentalizes different aspects of their life? At West Point, we say we want to lead honorably, live honorably, and strive for excellence. So if you're going to lead, you got to live honorably. You got to lead honorably, and you always strive for excellence.
Yeah, I love that. I'm curious, because awareness is an interesting topic. I'm curious your thoughts on, can that be trained? And is that something that someone can learn? I feel like I've got maybe a high level of self-awareness, and it's getting better, so it feels like it's moving forward, and I hope that continues. But from your experience, can that happen? Is there okay, there's a self-awareness course? I don't know. It's messy to me. What are your thoughts, Bob?
Well, I think it's a great point, Ron. I think it has to be trained. And here's why. Throughout our lives, we rise in organizations at a relatively slow pace, right? And we think of ourselves as much younger, much less mature than others think of us. I mean, I still think of myself as 50 and I'm 70, right? So you have to have somebody looking from the outside, helping you remember where you were and that you're at a different point now and you're perceived in a different way.
Interesting. And does self-awareness fit into one of those 5 E's, or is it, when you engage with the folks around you, that you would see if you're aware or not? Because you would fill it out too and be like, I'm energizing. Well, geez, Bob, not so much. How does it fit in?
Yeah, I think in engagement, that's where you'll get a lot of that self-awareness. For example, how many parents have you seen try to be the brother or sister of their children?
Or partner?
Or partner, whatever, I mean, but not realize parenting is a different role,
Right.
and how many leaders have you seen where you're ready to promote them and they're not ready for the next level? They can't escape where they were. I used to think to myself that I knew somebody was ready for promotion because they were already behaving as if they were at the next level.
Interesting. Yeah, because that makes me think a lot about and I think I've not done a good job in this sometimes. So if I'm doing a people and culture talk, someone's hired me to do this, and it's been a long journey, and I feel like I've not done a good job, and maybe on leadership sometimes too, with meeting them where they're at. And so, we have unlimited vacation and mandatory life days, but we started by pulling straws to see who was going to work from home on Friday. And they might be there, and I'm talking about unlimited vacation. They're like, "What? If we do that, we're out of business tomorrow." Does leadership, do you view it as the same way? And how do you figure out where someone's at?
Yeah, I think that's a great point, Ron. You're demonstrating great self-awareness with that point, because leadership is a journey, it's not a destination, right? And you've got, if you don't recognize the journey and where the organization is on that journey, you're going to be hopeless in your ability to get to the next level. I like to talk about standing on the shoulders of the giants who came before me. Even even when you're following someone who may have been released from the role, you still got to recognize that many people followed that individual and trusted that individual. So you can't come in and disparage everything that occurred under that individual's leadership. It just doesn't make sense because everybody does a good job. And sometimes as leaders, we're appropriate for a certain situation or we're not appropriate for another. So totally with you on that. And I think you got to recognize where the organization is on journey. I remember at the VA, we were going through John Cotter's 8 Steps of Change model, and we were going through all the changes we were doing to try to get trust up. When we started, trust was at 47%. About the time we ended, I think we were about 60%. Today, it's about 80%. But as we were going through that, my team kept saying, well, we need to change this. We need to change. No, we got to map out and sequence these changes because you can't do everything at once. If you do, the organization will fall apart. And while you talked about how you deal with your dyslexia and your ADD, I tend to draw pictures or ask people to draw pictures, and that helps me understand. So we actually mapped out all the changes, and we'd sit there and say, hey, we can make this change, but let's wait. This change would be better sequenced after another change. And so you got to be deliberate about that, very deliberate.
Yeah, look, I couldn't agree more. Leadership in business is a game of inches. I was talking about this with a group that's down to see us from the north, and we're talking about the Vita model, and we're exploring, helping implementing the platform in the north, and housing, healthcare. I mean, people and politicians, especially, everyone just smokes everybody else's idea because they're looking for the silver bullet that solves 30,000 things. That's impossible. It's a game of inches that becomes a mile,
Absolutely.
Yeah. And I find too, I was thinking about like people that over process stuff. And so if I'm solving a problem, I build out those 12 steps, but you don't know what you don't know. You better move to step 1 and figure out if step 2 even makes sense anymore. And I think a lot of people
Yeah.
have a hard time, what's the word, like letting go of that and not being, it feels like you've lost control maybe. I think people struggle with that.
Yeah, I agree with you. You've got to be agile through the process because you're going to learn something with everything you do. And you got to put in, Deming calls it a plan, do, check, act cycle. So you plan something, you do it, you check it, and then you act upon the check. You have a feedback loop, and you got to constantly have that feedback loop. I guess Jim Collins calls it a flywheel. Constantly have that feedback loop that's informing your process as you go.
So let's go to Jim Collins. Great timing. I had the pleasure, I guess it was in last fall. I can't even remember, but I went to a full day, 1 day workshop with Jim in Chicago with a good friend of mine from Toronto, Richard Abud. And I mean, I thought it was fantastic. I've read all his books. We subscribe to the Flywheel, the 100-mile march or whatever that is. We subscribe to a lot of the Jim Collins things. What things did you embed to the business, and what things would you change anything from his strategy? What are the things that you really lean into and maybe leave behind?
Well, I had Jim come to Procter and Gamble when I was CEO and spoke to our 250 or so top leaders. I think Jim is one of the best minds there's ever been on leadership. I then subsequently helped, as part of a group, convince him to be the visiting leadership chair at West Point, and he was fantastic there. But just to tell you a little bit about Jim, one of the things we have to do at West Point to graduate is do something called the indoor obstacle course, which is just a hellacious physical exercise, and you have to complete it in a certain length of time. I don't recall how old Jim was at the time, maybe 55 or so, but Jim said before he left West Point, he wanted to complete the indoor obstacle course at graduation time. And he did. And he did.
Wow.
Now, I think the most value, if I step way back, I mean, Jim's got so many great teachings. If I step way back from it, the most powerful thing I've ever read that he said was leadership is building a clock, not telling time. And that to me captures all the 5 E's and our mutual dedication to the organization that we're trying to lead. It's really about building a clock.
I
And
love
because the acid test of any organization is how does it perform when you're gone
that's it.
or when
That's
you're not there?
yeah, real sustainability, right?
Exactly.
For me, and you already mentioned it, but it's the flywheel that was instrumental for me because, I can be very shiny object, move, move, move. And the flywheel really provided focus, building the flywheel. We go back to it all the time. We try to check and balance decision making. Where does that decision going to live in the flywheel? Will it enhance it or detract? Get rid of it? It's been very helpful because I feel like for chapter 2 now with my real estate company, chapter 1 was the security business. But I would say that and with tools like Jim's, I've really gone from distracting the organization. Let's open a restaurant, Bob, and a second restaurant. These have nothing to do with the core business, and I know business doing it and different customer. I mean, I could go on forever about it. But from being the chief distraction officer to now I'm the umbrella for the organization, and I've tried
Right.
to utilize that innovative creativeness inside the business. I don't know why I couldn't before. Maybe I didn't love the business as much. I probably have to reflect on that. But I find that's been a big change in the flywheel. Has been instrumental.
Well, that entrepreneurial spirit and incentive that you have internally is something you never want to lose. And the only question is, and you've got it, is how do you manage it so you're not doing things which may be counter to the strategies of your business?
Yeah, totally.
You've
And
been
so,
terribly successful, so you're doing great.
oh, thanks, Bob. I love it. Well, look, I get to meet folks like yourself and get to take a lot of notes. And having a business, I execute. I leave these interviews, and I get to forge deeper relationships, learn a ton. It forces me to learn, and then I move. I think I've in some cases, I'll probably hang up on you early, Bob, because I have stuff to do now.
Right.
I want to go to related to West Point. So you and your wife Diane created the McDonald Conference for Leadership of Character at West Point. When did you do that? And was that and tell us the why? What sparked it, and when and why?
Well, that was we started thinking about it about 15 years ago, 14, 15 years ago. And believe it or not, what sparked it was I received a leadership award from the Naval Academy. Naval Academy and Harvard Business Review gave me a leadership award, and I was really mad. I didn't want to accept it because I didn't want the Naval Academy, which is the rival of West Point, the Army Military Academy, branding leadership as one of its things, because I thought, we're leadership. So I brought a member of the Association of Graduates with me, and when I got the award, and then I went to West Point, and I said, we've got to do something here to spread our brand, spread our knowledge. I mean, it's wonderful that we're training leaders of character for the Army and for the nation at West Point, but we have an opportunity here to train civilian leaders as well and create a cohort between our military and civilian leaders, because in the United States, there's now a civil military divide. Only 1% of the country is involved in the military. And I worry about that because your military needs to be representative of your democracy. So I worked with Tom Kolditz, again, the head of the Department of Behavioral Science and Leadership at the time. And we developed this idea that we would use the Procter & Gamble recruiting list of universities around the world. We would ask each university president to pick their best leader, send them to West Point at no cost. Deanna and I would fund the entire thing. And we'd spend 4 or 5 days together working the real knotty problems. And basically the theory is that going around the world, I would talk to consumers using Procter & Gamble products. On any given day, 5 billion people on the planet use at least one Procter & Gamble product. And at the end of the interview, I'd always say, well, what's your dream? And no matter where I was in a nipa hut, out in a jungle or whatever, they'd say, my dream is the next generation has a better life. And with that consistency of dream, why can't we get along? Why can't we solve these problems? Why can't we work together? So it was my belief that the real knotty problems of the world are going to be solved not by any one person, not by any one country, but by all of us banding together. So here I'm able Deanne and I are able, West Point's able to get a head start on this by taking these young people, generally they're juniors at university, they're the top leaders of their schools, putting them together, creating a cohort, having a leadership experience, which for many is life-changing, and then sending them back out and hopefully, and then keeping them connected digitally, at least, if not physically, to solve problems in the future.
Yeah, what a great flywheel, right, of its own.
That's the intent. That's the intent.
Yeah.
We've had great things happen. We've had people take on substantive leadership positions within their countries. We've had people start nonprofits. We've had marriages between people. It's been quite rewarding.
So what are the key leadership tenets? I know you talk about this a lot, but from military over, because the 5 E's were created. Was there something missing, or what was the key that you see from strong leadership, from military to business?
That's a really interesting question, Ron, and it's one I thought a lot about. In the military, you love the people you work with. I loved my soldiers. I was responsible for their lives. We jumped out airplanes together with parachutes. We put our lives in danger together. We relied on each other to care for each other. And what I would say at Procter & Gamble is I can train you in all the 5E behaviors of leadership, but for those to be authentic and repeatable, you've got to love the people you work with. And one of the things sometimes it's missing in business is that love. Now, it's missing in the military too, but obviously in situations more dangerous in the military, so you grow to love, or you tend to get rejected by the organization. And that's what I struggle with in business. Business leadership can be too mercenary, too mercantilistic, and not enough focusing, not enough realizing or growing the love of the people in the organization.
I've when you're saying that, I'm thinking, how do I practice that? Or what's a real life example? And I think about when I have to have a tough conversation with someone. So somebody has really pissed me off, and because I've right or wrong word, but I'm annoyed with them, and so my love is down, no matter who that individual is. I'm still emotional about it. I won't have my conversation until I'm feeling really good and loving Bob again. Now it's time to chat, and I'll start with a big hug, and I'll tell you, Bob, I waited because I was annoyed. Now I love you again, and we're good to go. And I kind of am
Yeah, and
transparent about
you
that.
probably talked to me about that aberrant behavior I did in the context of I'm doing this. I know it doesn't feel good, but I'm doing it because I love you,
Right.
and I want you to grow. And you're not going to grow if you keep doing this.
Right. So
Um,
the intent, being clear about your intent for their benefit.
yeah, I mean, it's unfortunate, but when I was a cadet at West Point in 1973, I think it was, one of the most popular movies that year, I think it won an Academy Award, was Patton. And people tended to get the idea that the kind of leadership that George C. Scott demonstrated in Patton was military leadership, standing in front of an American flag, spewing profanity, slapping a soldier in the hospital. But yeah, I have to remind people that Eisenhower and Marshall were much smarter than that. They knew that Patton wasn't the appropriate leader for many situations. They didn't have him lead the Normandy invasion. They took him out. They had him create a dummy organization, but they put him in when they needed to drive across Europe. And so, what you find with leaders, we all have different styles and different proclivities, and our job as leaders is to put leaders in the right job. To, as Jim says, Jim Collins, put the right people on the bus, give them the right seats on the bus. And one size fits all is leadership. And at the Procter & Gamble company, I fought against this stereotype where when I would walk in a room, if somebody knew I'd gone to West Point, spent time in the military, they would assume I was a believer in the George C. Scott, George's Patton type of leadership.
And is that, and so sorry to interrupt, Bob, is that more command and control? I'm not familiar with that.
Yeah. Command and control, kick them in the butt. Now, that's being unfair to Patton, because if you study the life of George Patton, I mean, this guy loved his soldiers more than anybody. He was caught in many videos or many films crying, and he was I think when he liberated Dachau or one of the concentration camps, Ike went in and asked for every soldier to go through the concentration camp to see why they were fighting for what they were fighting for. And Patton was one of the few, I think, who refused to do it because he knew he couldn't handle it emotionally. So, I want to be fair too. I think too often we, and particularly media, and particularly social media, tend to caricature people, and we are much more complex than caricatures.
Totally. Bob, I'm curious at Procter and Gamble, because this keeps me up at night as my business is scaling, is the further and further when the business grows, I become further and further away. I get further and further away from the customers. How did you combat that? How did you keep your finger on the pulse first? Like, tell me, Ron, what Sarah says, that Susie says, that John says, back to the customer feedback, which is 5 layers deep. How did you, what strategies? And I know at West Point, I don't know which talk it came from, but it hit home with continue to eat the pizza. What was your version of eating the pizza?
Yeah, it's interesting. I had the benefit. My children accuse me of this, and it's a fair accusation. I had the benefit of living through and leading globalization. When I in 1989, when I was sent to Toronto, I said, what did I do wrong? Because I wasn't in a succession plan in my home organization. And the leadership of the company said, no, we're trying to create a cadre of globally effective leaders to lead our company in the future. At the time, 70-80% of our sales were in the US. At the time I retired, 70-80% were outside the US. And so I
Wow.
was in Asia for 10 years. And during that time, the Berlin Wall fell. We entered Russia. We entered China. And so I got to see that. And our leadership of our company did a very, very smart thing. And I think John Smale, John Pepper, A.G. Lafley deserve credit for this. But back in the early 80s, as we noticed this was happening, we said, you know what? In Cincinnati, Ohio, our global headquarters, the leadership of the company would all eat lunch together on the 11th floor of the building. And so much information, so much eat the pizza was transferred during those meetings. How do we codify this for a company that's growing around the world and we're entering many different countries? So we literally had a group sit down and write down purpose, values, and principles of the company. And those animated our global expansion. And what we would do is we would translate them into foreign languages. So, for example, it does no good to have purpose, values, and principles in English when you're in Japan, because sure, the Japanese people will understand it, but they have an alphabet for foreign words. They never take the foreign words and translate them into the Japanese alphabet. That's very complicated. I won't go into detail unless you want it later. But
You have to draw that one for me, Bob. You're going to draw it for me.
yeah, so we literally would get groups of people together and translate the purpose, values, and principles into the local language, and that created a process of understanding the depth of which you could not achieve otherwise, and that was incredibly powerful. Second thing we did was we transferred managers around the world. So like I served in Canada, I served in the Philippines, I served in Japan, I served in Belgium. And there's no better way to become cross-culturally competent than live and work in different cultures.
Don't lose your path on the third thing, but just the language you just used. I'm not used to that. That sounded military language. I served in, and so that's a really interesting choice of words for I ran that office, it was my region. I served. That's really interesting.
Well, that was an intentional choice because the purpose of the purpose of Procter & Gamble company is to improve the lives of the world's consumers. So my mindset in visiting with consumers using our products was, I'm here to serve you. How can I better serve you? And I think
Right.
I'm not here to make money off of you. Making money, yes, but that will come if I serve you well.
Right. Yeah. So go to the 3, Bob.
Well, third thing was we put the structure in place. So we had the same leadership structure. We had the same strategic choices. We had the same systems globally. We had the same culture globally. And we worked really hard to have a consistent global culture that would be dominant over the national culture, because there were parts of the national culture that you may or may not want. I'm
Right.
reading a great book right now on the explorer James Cook, and he was killed in Hawaii, and the indigenous people kept taking the iron from his ship, because to them all property was socialized, and he called it stealing. And I get it, but there are different parts of different cultures that are acceptable or not.
Yeah, really interesting. So Bob, what's something we haven't talked about today that is either top of mind, you're concerned with, today's leaders? What are you working on? Leave us with something that we didn't get a chance to talk about today.
Well, I'm working on a lot of things. I'm the chairman of the board of the West Point Association of Graduates, and we're doing a lot there. I think one of the things that's most powerful about the West Point culture and the West Point experience is the honor code. I won't lie, cheat, steal, and importantly, nor tolerate those who do. So there's an expectation that you're as guilty of lying, cheating, or stealing if you don't turn in or expose the individual on your right or on your left who did so. And that's a really, really hard tenet for high school graduates to embrace, because you don't want to tell on somebody else. But on the other hand, if this is a culture, a community we're trying to create where all of our lives are at risk and we have to trust each other, you don't want to have somebody in that situation who would be willing to tolerate it.
Yeah, couldn't agree more. And
And
you're right.
that's hard.
That's going to be a very tough transition, right? Very tough.
Well, it is, and it's made even more tough because that honor code has been the honor code of West Point for hundreds of years, but yet we see in our culture, no matter the country, the slippage on some of these values that have been time tested. I mean, I don't think anyone would say, yeah, I want to join an organization that lies and cheats and steals, or I want to follow a leader who lies constantly. But yet that's what we're faced with every single day.
Yeah, interesting. Bob, look, I couldn't thank you enough for joining me today. I've got 2 pages of notes, lots to think about, lots to lean into. Thanks for everything you're doing. Thanks for giving back and providing your content and leadership and teachings. The world's very lucky to have you.
Well, thank you, Ron. It's been a joy to be with you and a joy to be with your folks, and I look forward to keeping up the friendship.
For more information about Bob or his work, please follow him on LinkedIn. To learn more about our books or our Scaling Culture Masterclass on how to build and sustain a resilient, high-performing team, please go to scalingculture.org. And lastly, if you enjoyed this episode, please leave us a comment and share the podcast with one of your friends or colleagues. We'll be back soon with another incredible guest.